He married my sister, but secretly loved my wife. The twisted truth I uncovered changed everything. Hello, read it. Life has a way of hiding its fractures until the moment they break. My name is David, and I'm 34 years old. For most of my adult life, I thought I'd found stability. 8 years ago, I married Emily, the kind of woman who could bring light into any room. She's warm, compassionate, and the kind of person who makes even the most mundane days feel special. Together, we built what I thought was a strong foundation. Our life isn't flashy or filled with extravagant adventures, but it's ours, a quiet suburban home, shared meals, and plans for a future we both look forward to. It's the kind of life that feels safe. Or at least it did. Family has always been a cornerstone of my identity. Growing up, our parents drilled into my sister, Hannah, and me the importance of staying close, no matter what. While we weren't especially tight as kids, our personalities clashed more often than not. We found a way to reconnect as adults. I'm older by 4 years, the cautious and steady one to Hannah's bold, impulsive nature. She has a knack for diving headfirst into life, a trait I've admired and resented in equal measure. 5 years ago, she married Jared. From the beginning, Jared seemed too perfect. He's tall, successful, and carries himself with the confidence of someone who's never questioned his place in the world. He works in real estate, a field that seems to thrive on his polished charisma. People warm to him easily, drawn to his effortless charm and quick wit. But for all his likability, I could never fully trust him. His charm felt too rehearsed, his smiles calculated rather than genuine. I often found myself second-guessing my instincts, wondering if I was simply being overprotective of my sister. After all, Hannah adored him, and Emily, who has always been far better at reading people than I am, assured me that Jared was harmless. In January, we hosted one of our regular family dinners, a small tradition we'd started to keep everyone connected. Emily loved these gatherings, throwing herself into every detail, from the carefully planned menu to the little decorative touches that made our home feel warm and inviting. That night, the house smelled of roasted garlic and herbs, and the dining table was set with Emily's best dishes. Hannah and Jared arrived on time, bringing their usual energy and stories. Jared, as always, commanded attention. His laugh rang out louder than anyone else's, his stories exaggerated just enough to keep people hanging on every word. He had a way of turning even the simplest anecdotes into performances, and people always seemed eager to applaud. That night, though, something about him fell off. His energy was sharper, more intense. He leaned into conversations with a kind of focus that felt less like engagement and more like scrutiny. As the evening progressed, I started to notice the way Jared's attention kept circling back to Emily. It wasn't obvious at first, just a compliment here, a lingering glance there. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. He laughed a little too hard at her jokes, praised her cooking a little too often, and found excuses to steer the conversation toward her. Emily, ever the gracious hostess, smiled politely and responded in kind, but there was something in her eyes that told a different story. She avoided looking directly at him for too long, her laughter sounding hollow. By the time we sat down for dessert, the air in the room felt heavier. Jared had become louder, his humor veering into territory that felt inappropriate. He teased Hannah in ways that made her roll her eyes, then turned his attention back to Emily with a kind of intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to redirect the conversation, to steer things toward neutral ground, but Jared seemed intent on holding the spotlight. It was a small moment that stuck with me, one I replayed in my mind for days after. Emily had excused herself to the kitchen to retrieve the coffee, and Jared followed moments later under the pretense of helping. I stayed behind, not wanting to leave Hannah sitting alone. But as I listened to Hannah talk about her latest work project, my thoughts were elsewhere. Jared's movements felt deliberate, his timing calculated. Something about the way he glanced back at the table before disappearing into the kitchen left me uneasy. When they returned, something had shifted. Emily looked pale, her usual warmth replaced by a strained politeness. Jared, on the other hand, seemed more at ease, even smug. It was subtle, the kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had passed between them in those few moments out of sight. something I wasn't meant to know. After they left, the house felt eerily quiet. Emily began cleaning up right away, her movements stiff and mechanical, as though she were trying to distract herself. I offered to help, but she waved me off without meeting my eyes. When I asked if everything was all right, she forced a smile and said she was just tired. It wasn't like her to shut me out, but I told myself not to push. Over the next few days, that tension grew. Emily seemed distracted, lost in thought during moments when she would normally be chatting about her day or sharing a funny story. She avoided certain topics, redirecting conversations away from anything that might touch on Jared or Hannah. It was unlike her, and it left me feeling unmoored. I replayed the dinner in my mind over and over, scrutinizing every detail for clues about what I might have missed. The way Jared's attention had lingered on Emily, the way she had stiffened under his gaze, the silence that hung between them when they returned from the kitchen. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into things. But the more I thought about it, the harder it became to shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as though I were standing on the edge of a cliff, feeling the ground beneath me begin to crumble. The cracks were small at first, barely noticeable, but they were there, waiting to spread. And deep down, I knew that whatever lay beneath the surface of that night wasn't going to stay hidden for long. In the days following that dinner, the unease that had settled over me didn't fade, it grew. Emily's quietness, her distracted demeanor, had become impossible to ignore. She moved through our home like a ghost, her thoughts somewhere I couldn't follow. Normally, we shared everything. She'd come to me with her joys, frustrations, and worries. But now, it felt as though there was a wall between us, one I hadn't seen her build and didn't know how to tear down. At first, I told myself it was just a bad week. Maybe she was stressed, or maybe I was overanalyzing the way her behavior had shifted. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the memories of that night at dinner replayed in my mind like a loop I couldn't escape. The lingering glances, the tension in Emily's posture, the way Jared seemed to gravitate toward her, it all stuck with me, like a bad taste I couldn't wash out. Emily started spending more time out of the house, running errands that stretched longer than usual or staying late at work. When she was home, she avoided sitting still for too long. She cleaned rooms that didn't need cleaning, reorganized already tidy drawers, and busied herself with tasks that seemed invented just to keep her moving. She was never one to sit idly, but this was different. She wasn't simply busy, she was avoiding something. And yet every time I tried to bring it up, she brushed me off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'd always known Emily to be strong, the kind of person who faced challenges head-on. Seeing her withdraw like this felt like watching a stranger move through our home. It wasn't just Emily's behavior that haunted me. Jared had taken up space in my mind, too, in ways I didn't want to admit. The way he'd followed Emily into the kitchen, the way they'd returned with that unspoken tension between them, it all pointed to something I couldn't quite put into words. And then there was the way he'd looked at her throughout the evening, with a focus that felt almost predatory. I found myself replaying every interaction I'd ever had with him, searching for signs I might have missed. Had there been moments before when his attention had lingered on Emily? Had I dismissed red flags as harmless because I didn't want to believe there could be a problem? The more I thought about it, the more questions piled up, each one heavier than the last. I decided to reach out to Hannah. We weren't the kind of siblings who confided in each other deeply, but if anyone could provide some insight into Jared's behavior, it would be her. I kept my message casual, framing it as a check-in rather than a pointed interrogation. But even as I hit send, I felt a pang of guilt. How could I even begin to explain the doubts swirling in my mind without causing unnecessary harm? What if I was wrong? Hannah replied quickly, her tone as cheerful as ever. She talked about work, her plans for the weekend, and how much she'd enjoyed dinner. She made no mention of Jared, except in passing, as though he were just another piece of her life rather than the centerpiece of mine at that moment. I wanted to press further, to ask if she'd noticed anything off about him lately, but I stopped myself. For now, I told myself it was better to observe than to accuse. Still, the questions continued to fester. I began watching Emily more closely, not out of mistrust, but out of desperation to understand what was happening. I noticed the way she flinched when her phone buzzed, the way her eyes darted toward the screen before she hurriedly flipped it face down. She'd never been secretive about her phone before. It usually sat openly on the kitchen counter or bedside table, notifications lighting up without a second thought. Now, it felt like a barrier, a window into something she didn't want me to see. One evening, when she left it on the counter to grab a glass of water, I found myself staring at it longer than I should have. My stomach churned at the thought of picking it up, of invading her privacy, but the pull was undeniable. What was I so afraid of finding? Or worse, what was I afraid of not finding? I didn't pick it up. Instead, I turned away, ashamed of the suspicion creeping into my thoughts. This was Emily, the woman I loved, the woman who had stood by me through every high and low of our life together. Whatever was going on, I had to trust her to come to me when she was ready. At least, that's what I told myself as the knot in my stomach tightened. A week after the dinner, I ran into Jared unexpectedly. I'd stopped by a coffee shop on my way home from work, hoping to clear my head before facing another evening of Emily's distance. As I waited in line, I spotted him sitting at a corner table, his laptop open in front of him. He hadn't noticed me yet, and for a moment, I debated walking out before he could. But curiosity, or maybe something darker, got the better of me. When I approached, Jared greeted me with his usual easy charm, acting as though nothing was out of the ordinary. He asked about Emily, about work, about everything except the growing tension that had consumed my life since that dinner. I answered in kind, forcing myself to play along, but my mind raced with questions I couldn't ask. Did he know how much space he was taking up in my head? Did he sense the unease that clung to me like a shadow? As I left the coffee shop, his voice followed me, light and casual as he called out a parting remark. It was innocuous, something about catching up soon, but it felt heavier than it should have. His words lingered in my mind for the rest of the evening, looping back on themselves until they took on a life of their own. By the time I got home, the weight of it all had become almost unbearable. Emily was in the living room, curled up with a book, her face calm but distant. The sight of her like that, so close, yet so unreachable, made my chest ache. Whatever was happening, whatever had shifted in our lives since that night, it was clear that this wasn't something I could ignore any longer. The silence in my life had become deafening. Days stretched into a tense monotony, filled with unspoken words and unanswered questions. Emily remained distant, her movements deliberate and controlled, as if any sudden shift might shatter the fragile equilibrium we were clinging to. She carried on with her routines, but the ease and joy that once defined her presence had faded. Our conversations felt like rehearsals, scripted exchanges designed to avoid the topics that hovered just beneath the surface. I tried to bury myself in work, hoping the distractions of deadlines and meetings would dull the gnawing sense of unease. But even there, I found no reprieve. My thoughts drifted constantly, circling back to Emily's quiet withdrawal, Jared's unnerving presence, and the dinner that had felt like the opening act to a play I wasn't ready to watch. It was as if my life had been split into two timelines, before and after that night. The shift in Emily's behavior was undeniable. She no longer lingered with me on the couch after dinner, no longer reached for my hand absent-mindedly, as she always had. Even the way she moved through the house seemed different, quieter, more calculated, as though she were trying to take up as little space as possible. The worst part was the nights. Lying next to her in bed, I could feel the distance between us more acutely than ever. She'd turn away from me, her breath slow and even, but I could tell she wasn't asleep. In those dark hours, my mind raced with possibilities. What had happened in that kitchen between her and Jared? The question haunted me, growing larger and more insistent with each passing day. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to ask. The fear of hearing something I couldn't unhear kept my mouth shut, even as my heart ached for answers. It wasn't until the following weekend that the tension finally broke. Hannah invited us over for dinner, a casual affair meant to return the favor of hosting. I hesitated before agreeing, the thought of facing Jared again filling me with dread. But declining would raise questions, and the last thing I wanted was to draw attention to the cracks in my world. Emily was unusually quiet on the drive to Hannah's house. She stared out the window, her expression blank, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. I wanted to reach out, to say something that might bridge the chasm between us, but the words caught in my throat. By the time we arrived, the weight of unspoken thoughts pressed down on me like a physical force. Hannah greeted us with her usual enthusiasm, pulling us into the warm chaos of her home. Jared was in the kitchen, a glass of wine in hand, his easy smile plastered across his face. He greeted me with the same practice charm as always, but his eyes flicked toward Emily just for a moment before returning to me. That glance was like a spark in a dry forest, setting off a fire of suspicion that I couldn't contain. Dinner was a blur of laughter and conversation, the kind that feels forced when you're trying too hard to pretend everything is fine. Hannah chatted animatedly about her latest work projects, her voice filling the spaces where silence might have crept in. Jared, as usual, played the role of attentive husband, nodding and smiling at all the right moments. But beneath his polished exterior, there was something off, a tension in the way he held himself, a flicker of something darker in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Emily barely spoke throughout the meal. She picked at her food, her gaze fixed on her plate, and responded to questions with short, polite answers. It was as though she were somewhere else entirely, 1,000 miles away from the table where we all sat. Jared, meanwhile, seemed perfectly at ease, his confidence grating against the growing knot in my stomach. After dinner, as we moved to the living room for drinks, I found myself watching Jared more closely. He was good at what he did, at making people like him, at deflecting attention away from himself when it suited him. But the more I studied him, the more I noticed the cracks in his performance. His laugh didn't quite reach his eyes. His movements, so smooth and deliberate, felt just a little too practiced. At one point, he stood and crossed the room to pour himself another drink. His path took him past Emily, who was sitting stiffly on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. As he walked by, his hand brushed against her shoulder, a fleeting, almost imperceptible touch that might have seemed accidental to anyone else. But I saw the way Emily flinched, the way her entire body tensed for just a moment before she forced herself to relax. It was in that moment that the fragile veneer I'd been clinging to finally cracked. The doubts and suspicions that had been building for weeks came crashing down all at once, flooding my mind with 1,000 unanswered questions. Jared's behavior, Emily's withdrawal, the strange tension that had taken root in our lives. It all pointed to something I couldn't ignore any longer. When we left Hannah's house that night, the car ride home was suffocatingly quiet. Emily stared out the window again, her face illuminated by the passing streetlights, while I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every instinct in me screamed to confront her, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down into a darkness I wasn't sure I wanted to face. Whatever was happening, whatever truth lay beneath the surface of our lives, it was clear that I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The time for silence was over. By the time Emily and I stepped back into the house, the tension between us felt unbearable. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pressing down on my chest and making it hard to breathe. She avoided looking at me, slipping out of her coat and heading straight to the bedroom without a word. The soft sound of the door clicking shut behind her was almost deafening in the stillness of the house. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty hallway. My hands were shaking, though I wasn't sure if it was from anger, frustration, or fear. The weight of everything I'd been holding inside was crushing me. I knew I couldn't let this go on any longer. Whatever had taken root between us, whatever had been building since that night at dinner, it needed to be confronted. But I couldn't bring myself to follow her, not yet. I sat in the living room instead, staring at the blank TV screen and letting the silence wrap around me. My mind raced with fragments of memories, half-formed suspicions, and questions I didn't know how to ask. The image of Jared brushing against Emily flashed in my mind again, followed by the way she had tensed, as if his touch had burned her. It hadn't been an accident. I was certain of that now. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Jared wasn't just an annoyance or a source of unease. He was a threat, something insidious that had wormed its way into the fabric of my family. But how deep did it go? Unable to sit still any longer, I found myself pacing the room, my thoughts churning. I needed answers. Not just from Emily, but from Jared, from Hannah, maybe even from myself. How had I missed this for so long? Had it been there all along, hidden in plain sight? Or was this something new? As I stood there, staring out the darkened window, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I grabbed it instinctively, my heart sinking when I saw the notification. It was from Jared. The message was short, almost casual, but it sent a chill down my spine. Good seeing you tonight. We should catch up one-on-one soon. The audacity of it made my blood boil. After everything he'd done, whatever it was he had done, he still had the gall to reach out like nothing was wrong. My first instinct was to ignore it, to let my silence speak for itself. But as I stared at the screen, an idea began to form. I typed out a reply, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. Sure. Let me know when you're free. It wasn't much, but it was a start. If Jared wanted to play games, I would meet him on his turf. But this time, I'd be ready. The next day, I kept my distance from Emily. It wasn't intentional, but the gulf between us seemed to grow wider with every passing hour. She left for work without a word, and when she returned that evening, she went straight to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. I stayed in the living room, my thoughts consumed by Jared and the web of lies I was starting to suspect surrounded him. I spent the night sifting through old memories, looking for anything that might point to the truth. There were small things, moments I dismissed at the time, but that now felt heavy with meaning. Jared's overly enthusiastic compliments toward Emily, the way he always seemed to position himself near her during family gatherings, the lingering glances I told myself were nothing. Had I really been so blind? My chance to confront him came sooner than I expected. Jared suggested meeting for drinks that Friday, and I agreed without hesitation. I told Emily I'd be working late, though she barely acknowledged me. The distance between us had become a chasm, and I hated how natural it was starting to feel. When I arrived at the bar, Jared was already there, sitting at a corner table with his usual easy confidence. He greeted me like an old friend, his smile warm and disarming. It made me sick. We exchanged pleasantries at first, the kind of surface-level chatter that felt like a formality. But as the conversation went on, I began steering it toward the things I really wanted to know. I asked about Hannah, about their marriage, about how he was finding time to balance work and family. Jared answered every question with practiced ease, his charm never faltering. But then I mentioned Emily. I kept my tone casual, asking if he'd noticed how stressed she seemed lately. It was a trap, one I wasn't even sure he would fall into. But the flicker of something in his eyes, a hesitation, a momentary shift in his expression, told me I was onto something. He recovered quickly, brushing off my comment with a vague remark about how everyone seemed to be feeling the weight of the new year. But that flicker was enough. It confirmed what I'd been dreading. Jared knew more than he was letting on. When I left the bar that night, I felt no closer to the truth, but I also felt more certain than ever that it was there, waiting to be uncovered. Jared's calm demeanor, his carefully chosen words, the calculated way he navigated the conversation, it all pointed to a man who had something to hide. Back at home, Emily was already asleep, or pretending to be. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her for a long time. Her back was turned to me, her breathing slow and steady, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Whatever she was hiding, it was eating away at her just as it was eating away at me. I climbed into bed, lying awake for hours as the pieces of my life continued to fall apart in slow motion. Whatever had started at that dinner was far from over, and I was running out of time to stop it. The following morning, I woke with a heavy sense of foreboding. The sleepless night had left me hollow, my mind a haze of unanswered questions and half-formed plans. Emily had already left for work by the time I pulled myself out of bed, leaving only the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. It felt like a ghost of her presence, a reminder of the distance that had grown between us. I sat in the kitchen, staring at my untouched coffee as Jared's words from the night before echoed in my mind. He'd been so careful, so measured, yet there was something in the way he deflected my questions about Emily that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. It was the ease with which he'd recovered, as though he'd done this before. I couldn't let it go any longer. When Emily returned that evening, the silence between us was louder than ever. She moved through the house like a shadow, avoiding my gaze and offering only curt responses to my attempts at conversation. My frustration boiled over as I watched her retreat to the bedroom, yet again, closing the door behind her as if she could shut me out of whatever was tormenting her. But this time, I didn't let her. I followed her, standing in the doorway as she pretended to busy herself with folding clothes that didn't need folding. My voice broke the heavy silence, calm but firm, as I told her we needed to talk. She froze, her hands gripping the fabric in her hands, her shoulders tense. I stepped further into the room, my pulse pounding in my ears as I finally asked the question that had been tearing at me for weeks. What happened between you and Jared? Emily's reaction was immediate and visceral. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands, as if my words had physically struck her. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and I could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven, as she struggled to compose herself. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were red, her expression a mix of guilt and despair that sent a chill through me. She began to speak, her voice trembling as she unraveled the truth I had been so desperate to avoid. Jared's behavior had been escalating for months, subtle at first, then more overt. He had found excuses to be near her at family gatherings, brushing against her in ways that felt too intentional to be accidents. He'd sent her messages, innocuous on the surface, but laced with an undercurrent of something darker. She had tried to ignore it, to brush it off as her imagination, until the night of that first dinner. That was when he had cornered her in the kitchen, his charming facade cracking as he confessed feelings he claimed to have harbored for years. He told her he had married Hannah because he couldn't have her, but that he'd never been able to let go of what he thought could have been. His words had been deliberate, calculated, designed to unsettle her. He'd even hinted that Hannah knew, that it was something she had come to accept over the years. Emily's voice broke as she described how trapped she had felt in that moment, caught between wanting to protect me from the truth and fearing what Jared might do if she exposed him. She hadn't told me sooner because she didn't know how to begin, because the shame of being dragged into his twisted web had left her paralyzed. I sat there, stunned, as her words sank in. Jared's obsession had been festering for years, hidden beneath the surface of our lives like a cancer. And Hannah, my sister, had known all along. The realization was like a blow to the chest, leaving me breathless. I knew what I had to do. The next day, I called Hannah, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. She answered with her usual cheerfulness, but the false warmth in her voice grated against my nerves. I wasted no time, asking her directly about Jared and what she had known. Her response was chilling in its simplicity. She didn't deny it. She explained that she had been aware of Jared's feelings for Emily almost from the beginning, but she had convinced herself that they would fade over time. When they didn't, she told herself it didn't matter, that as long as Jared stayed with her and kept up appearances, she could live with it. Her words made me feel like a stranger in my own family. How could she allow something so toxic to take root, to grow unchecked for years? Her selfishness, her willingness to sacrifice everyone else's happiness for the sake of her own fragile marriage, was beyond comprehension. That night, I confronted Jared one last time. I told him I knew everything, about his obsession, about the way he had manipulated Emily, about how Hannah had been complicit in his lies. For the first time, his mask slipped. He tried to laugh it off, to brush aside my accusations as misunderstandings. But his bravado was thin. Beneath it, I saw the cracks in his carefully constructed persona, the fear that his carefully balanced house of cards was finally collapsing. I cut ties with him that night, making it clear that he was no longer welcome in my life. As for Hannah, our relationship has never recovered. Her betrayal, her willingness to put her own desires above the well-being of the people she claimed to love, was something I could never forgive. Emily and I are still working to rebuild what Jared tried to destroy. It hasn't been easy, but the truth, as painful as it was, has given us the foundation to start over. And while the scars of this experience will always remain, they serve as a reminder of the strength we've found in each other, even in the face of betrayal.